They didn't just ignore me, they erased me. My sister's wedding, my own family's smiles, I was nothing. Just a shadow they forgot to invite. They thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd stay small. They thought I'd stay silent. I look up, determination burning in my eyes. I watched, I listened. Every word they whispered about me I recorded in my mind. Every insult, every dismissal, fuel for what was coming. They thought my wedding would be a secret, small, ignored. But I had a plan. If they erased me, the world would remember me instead. They thought they could decide my worth, my place, my happiness. But now the world was watching and they were nowhere to hide. I walked down the aisle. My presence is radiant but cold, commanding. Eyes meet family members' faces, shock, guilt, fear. They did not invite me, but they cannot stop the world from celebrating my life. Every slight, every humiliation paid attention to now on a scale they never imagined. I smile faintly, coldly, as the room goes silent. Revenge isn't fire, it's ice. It's patience, it's silence, it's letting them think they've won until the moment they realize they've lost everything. And now they know. Calm, unstoppable, victorious. They didn't just ignore me, they erased me. My sister's wedding, my own family's smiles, I was nothing. Just a shadow they forgot to invite. They thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd stay small. They thought I'd stay silent. But I noticed. I always notice. Every laugh, every whisper, every glance that cut me deeper than knives. Every word they spoke behind my back, every casual dismissal, every smile I wasn't allowed to share, I collected it all. I remembered it all. I remember standing outside my sister's wedding, watching the world I had always imagined as mine celebrate without me. My dress had been ready, my hair styled perfectly, but the invitation never came. They didn't call, they didn't text, they didn't even glance in my direction. And the worst part, they smiled, thinking I would forget. That I would let it go. But pain has a way of sharpening the mind, and humiliation makes you patient. I spent months walking among them silent, pretending to be the quiet one, the one who accepts everything. At work I smiled at everyone who mocked me, nodded politely to every snide remark, and laughed at every joke made at my expense. Inside I was plotting. Every small injustice, every slight, every bitter word, they all became building blocks. I was learning, I was waiting, I was growing. I remember the nights I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the perfect way to turn the world upside down, imagining a day when the tables would finally turn. They never suspected. They never imagined that the quiet one, the one they thought would crumble, would become unstoppable. When the time came to plan my own wedding, I knew I could not let it be ordinary. I would not invite them, but I would invite the world. Every colleague who had ever admired me, every friend who had ever respected me, every stranger who could become an ally, they would witness my rise. I created a list so vast that even my family's imagination could not contain it. Invitations were sent worldwide. People from cities they had never visited, people who had never met them, were suddenly arriving in droves. The whispers began before they even saw the first guest. The day of the wedding arrived, they looked around and didn't recognize the place. They didn't know half the people who smiled at me, cheered for me, celebrated me. Confusion spread across their faces like wildfire. Their whispers, their disbelief, it all fueled me more than any smile could. I walked down the aisle, my dress flowing, my head held high, my eyes cold and unwavering. They stared. Shock, guilt, fear, it was written across every face I had once known so intimately. They had tried to erase me from their lives. They had tried to make me invisible, to make me feel small, to remind me that I had no place in their world. But now they were powerless. The world had seen me. They could not control it, they could not undo it. Every slight they had inflicted, every humiliation they had caused, they had now lost control over my narrative. The guests were celebrating me, not them. I remember standing at the reception, watching the joy around me. Every laugh, every cheer, every clap was a confirmation that patience, endurance, and intelligence had finally triumphed over cruelty. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to confront them. My victory was quiet, cold, and undeniable. The weight of my presence, the magnitude of my plan, spoke louder than any words could. I had learned that revenge is not about anger, it is about precision. It is about letting people believe they have won while you silently orchestrate the perfect moment when they realize they have lost everything. They had been blind to my pain, blind to my suffering, blind to my resolve. And now, their blindness was complete. They were powerless. They tried to whisper to each other, to figure out how I had done it, to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The world had already celebrated me. My humiliation had turned into their confusion, and their arrogance had been shattered in silence. Every insult they had ever thrown at me came back in echoes of irrelevance. I walked among my guests, shaking hands, smiling faintly, letting everyone know without saying a word that I had been underestimated. The quiet girl, the invisible one, the one they thought they could crush, they had made a mistake. I had transformed my pain into power, my humiliation into strategy, and my invisibility into influence. Even my closest family members could not deny it. The pride, the joy, the astonishment on their faces was unmistakable. They had thought they could dictate who mattered and who did not, who deserved to be celebrated and who deserved to be ignored. But the world does not belong to the cruel or the arrogant. It belongs to those who endure, who think, and who act when the time is right. I remember looking out over the city from the balcony that night, watching the lights, the people, the world I had created around me. The air was cool, the night was silent, yet it roared with the triumph I felt inside. They had tried to diminish me, but they had failed. They had tried to erase me, but they had succeeded only in sharpening my focus. They had tried to break me, but they had forged me instead into something unrecognizable, something unstoppable. Revenge is not a scream or a punch or a tantrum. Revenge is patience. Revenge is subtlety. Revenge is intelligence wrapped in silence, revealed only when the consequences are unavoidable. And now the consequences were unavoidable. My family could no longer dictate my worth. My humiliation had turned into influence. My exclusion had turned into a celebration so vast that it could not be ignored. I smiled faintly, coldly, watching them grasp the reality of my power. I did not need to speak. My presence, my plan, my endurance, all of it spoke for itself, and in that silence, I found a satisfaction that anger could never provide, a victory that cruelty could never undermine, a triumph that no one could take away. I had been invisible, erased, dismissed, but now I was seen, celebrated, respected, and remembered. And they, the ones who had tried to destroy me, understood too late that their control had been an illusion. I stood tall, calm, unstoppable. The whispers of the past had turned into the applause of the present. The shadows of humiliation had been replaced by the light of undeniable power. I had endured, I had planned, I had executed, and I had won. Revenge had not been a fire, it had been ice, silent, patient, lethal. And now they knew. They thought I would crumble. They thought that after the humiliation of my sister's wedding, after being forgotten, erased, dismissed, I would shrink into the shadows and let the pain fade without consequence. But they underestimated the quiet strength that grows inside a person who has been ignored, who has been hurt, who has been made to feel invisible. That strength does not scream or shout, it waits, it calculates, it plans, it observes. Every family gathering I attended after that day became a lesson. Every smirk, every subtle jab, every fleeting look of superiority was noted and stored. I learned their weaknesses, their patterns, the ways they thought themselves untouchable. I watched their arrogance, their sense of entitlement, and realized it was their blind faith in their own power that would eventually be their undoing. The months passed, I worked, I lived, but always with a quiet fire burning inside me. I cultivated connections, people who admired me, respected me, whose loyalty was earned silently. I reached out to distant colleagues, friends I barely knew, old acquaintances who had once praised my intelligence, my charm, my wit. Every person I reached, every hand I shook, every smile I gave was a brick in the foundation of the world I was building, my world, where their cruelty would no longer dominate the narrative. Planning my wedding became an art. Each invitation was a calculated stroke. Each guest was someone who would witness my rise, someone who would celebrate me, someone who would reinforce that the small, unseen girl they had ignored had transformed into someone unstoppable. My family thought that the day would be small, private, unnoticed. They thought they could dictate who mattered and who didn't. They were wrong. They would never see it coming. The day arrived, and it was more than I could have imagined. Guests poured in from cities and countries my family had never visited. People who had admired me, who had respected me, who had no allegiance to my family but were drawn to me, arrived to celebrate my life. Confusion clouded the faces of my parents, my sister, and every relative who had once mocked or ignored me. They tried to whisper, to understand, to regain control, but it was impossible. The world I had built was beyond their influence. As I walked down the aisle, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. I did not need to speak. Every glance from my family, every look of shock and fear, every moment of disbelief was confirmation of the meticulous planning that had brought me here. I hadn't planned. I had executed. And I had triumphed. I remembered every moment of pain, every instance of exclusion, every insult, every laugh behind my back. Each of those moments had been recorded in my mind, cataloged with precision. And now those moments fueled this celebration, this perfect reversal of roles. The quiet, invisible girl was now the center of attention, the one being celebrated, the one whose power could not be denied. They tried to understand how it had happened. How I had amassed such influence, such presence, such undeniable importance. But their arrogance blinded them. They could not see the patience behind it, the intelligence, the silent hours of planning, the endless observation of their weaknesses. They had created the perfect conditions for my rise without ever realizing it. Every smile I gave, every toast I raised, every laugh I shared was a quiet, deliberate triumph. I did not need to confront them. I did not need to explain. The mere presence of so many people, the world recognizing my worth, was punishment enough. Their silence, their confusion, their inability to comprehend what had happened, was the revenge I had envisioned. As the night deepened, I stood on the balcony, looking over the crowd, looking over the lights of the city. The cool night air wrapped around me, carrying with it the weight of every injustice I had endured. But it also carried triumph. I had been underestimated, overlooked, erased. And now I had transformed all that pain into power, all that exclusion into recognition, all that silence into a deafening statement of my strength. Revenge, I realized, is not about fury or confrontation. It is about strategy, about patience, about understanding that the smallest moves, executed flawlessly over time, can create consequences far greater than anyone could anticipate. They had tried to dictate my life, to decide my worth, to control my happiness. They had failed. And the world which they could not influence had witnessed my rise, my triumph, my calculated, inevitable victory. Even my family, the ones who had caused me the most pain, could not deny it. The magnitude of what I had created, the scale of the celebration, the recognition I had achieved, it was undeniable. They had tried to erase me, to make me invisible, to convince me that I was unworthy, but they had underestimated patience. They had underestimated intelligence. They had underestimated the silent power that grows inside someone who has been wronged. And now, as I watched the crowd, I understood that true revenge is not loud. True revenge is not immediate. True revenge is a slow burn, a quiet accumulation of power, revealed only when the moment is perfect. It is an art of control, precision, and timing. And in that moment, standing above the crowd, watching the culmination of my plan unfold, I felt the complete, undeniable satisfaction of it. I had been invisible, dismissed, humiliated, and excluded. But I had transformed that pain into power. I had turned exclusion into celebration, erasure into recognition, humiliation into triumph. They had thought they could shape my life, define my worth, dictate my happiness. But I had rewritten the rules. The quiet, underestimated girl had emerged victorious, unstoppable, unbroken. And as the night came to a close, as the last of the guests left with smiles and admiration, I stood alone for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. Revenge is not just about punishment, it is about restoration. It is about reclaiming the narrative, asserting control over one's life, and proving in a way that cannot be denied that the person you tried to destroy is stronger than you ever imagined. And they, the ones who had tried to control, who had tried to diminish me, who had tried to erase me, finally understood too late. Too late to stop it. Too late to undo the quiet, calculated, unstoppable rise of the girl they thought they had broken. I was seen, I was celebrated, I was powerful. And they were left to reckon with the consequences of their own arrogance. The end. Yeb total 2000 words. Cinematic emotional revenge story. Script band Gaia high full continuous flow simple text ready for narration YouTube or voiceover. Agar Kaho domain Isklay YouTube description hashtags. Keywords tags are why watch section by ready Cardoon Bilkul upload ready. Kaya main Wabana Dune. I learned that patience was my greatest weapon. While they celebrated themselves, while they laughed and whispered about my absence, I watched quietly, storing every detail, every pattern, every weakness. Every smile they thought friendly, every gesture they thought harmless, I recorded in my mind. I understood them in ways they could never imagine. What made them proud, what made them afraid, what they considered untouchable. And I realized that their arrogance was their vulnerability. I began preparing for a revenge that would be felt long before it was seen. Every move was deliberate. I reached out to distant contacts, influential friends, strangers who admired perseverance, and slowly built a network of people who would witness the truth of my worth. I cultivated not only admiration but also curiosity. Invitations were sent discreetly but strategically, people who would arrive unannounced, who would shake their assumptions, who would subtly reveal the magnitude of my influence. Every detail of my plan was calculated with precision, down to the last smile, the last whispered comment, the last shocked glance. The night before my wedding I could hardly sleep, not because of nerves but because of anticipation. Every thought was a rehearsal of the perfection of my plan. I imagined their faces when they realized that my presence, once invisible, now commanded attention, respect, and admiration on a scale they could never match. I imagined the disbelief, the guilt, the fear, the understanding that they had misjudged me all along. And I smiled quietly, with the cold satisfaction of inevitability. When the day arrived, the world became my stage. Guests arrived from cities and countries my family had never heard of, people who had heard of me and my story, people who respected me, people whose presence validated my worth. My family stared in disbelief, whispering to each other, trying to understand how this had happened, trying to regain some sense of control. But it was impossible. I had already rewritten the rules, and they were powerless to stop the unfolding reality. I walked down aisle, calm and collected, every step deliberate, every glance measured. Their faces betrayed the shock they could not hide, the realization that the quiet, overlooked girl they had mocked had orchestrated an event they could not comprehend. Every gasp, every whispered question, every glance of confusion was a testament to my planning, my patience. And I did not speak. I did not need to. My presence spoke volumes. Every smile I gave, every acknowledgement of my guests, every quiet nod to those who had supported me was a confirmation that I had endured, that I had grown, that I had triumphed. My victory was not loud. It did not need to be. It was seen in the eyes of those who mattered, felt by those who had once dismissed me, undeniable and complete. As the reception continued, I moved among the guests, exchanging pleasantries, smiling faintly, never breaking the calm composure that had become my armor. I watched my family, every whispered attempt to regain composure, every frantic calculation of how they could appear relevant in a situation they did not control. And I realized that the most satisfying revenge is not confrontation, but the silent acknowledgement of their impotence, the quiet revelation that they could not influence my life, my worth, my triumph. The night deepened, and I found a moment to step away, to the balcony overlooking the city. The lights stretched endlessly, a reflection of the countless lives who had celebrated me, recognized me, and elevated me. And in that silence I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the exclusion, the humiliation, the patience, the careful calculation, the intelligence, the subtle yet relentless determination. Every moment of suffering had been transformed into power, every insult into strategy, every dismissal into fuel. I understood now that revenge is not about vengeance alone. It is about restoration, about reclaiming control over one's narrative, about demonstrating that the person who has been underestimated is capable of reshaping reality itself. The quiet girl, the one who had been excluded, dismissed, and humiliated, had become a force that no arrogance, no cruelty, no assumption could contain. Even my closest relatives could not deny the scale of what had been achieved. The guests, their admiration, the celebration, it was overwhelming, undeniable, absolute. They had attempted to dictate my life, to erase my presence, to control my worth, and they had failed spectacularly. They had misjudged the quiet strength that grows in the absence of acknowledgement, the patience that forms in silence, the intelligence that thrives in observation. And I knew that this was not merely victory, it was a lesson that power lies not in arrogance, not in exclusion, not in control, but in endurance, strategy, and subtlety. They had thought themselves untouchable, unchallenged, dominant, but they were nothing compared to the careful, calculated force that had emerged from their own cruelty. As I looked out over the city, I allowed myself a rare, genuine smile, not of joy, not of celebration, but of quiet, absolute triumph. They had underestimated me, erased me, mocked me, excluded me, and yet here I stood, surrounded by evidence of my influence, my reach, my strength. The world had acknowledged me, celebrated me, and they had been powerless to stop it. The echoes of their arrogance and cruelty faded in the presence of my patience, my intelligence, my quiet, relentless strategy. The power they had attempted to wield over me had been inverted, turned back upon them with precision and subtlety, and I knew that nothing they could do would ever undo the reality I had created, the undeniable recognition of my worth, the celebration of my existence, the evidence of my unstoppable rise. I had been invisible, dismissed, humiliated, erased, and now I was seen, celebrated, recognized, and respected. I had transformed every slight, every insult, every moment of exclusion into fuel, into strategy, into power, and they, the ones who had attempted to control, dominate, and diminish me, were left powerless, forced to witness a reality they had never anticipated, a triumph they could not comprehend, a victory they could not undo. Revenge is not immediate and it is not loud. True revenge is a patient, deliberate, calculated art. It is the slow, inevitable unveiling of consequences that cannot be avoided, the demonstration that every slight, every injustice, every attempt at domination can be transformed into an opportunity for absolute triumph. And in that truth I found a satisfaction far deeper than anger, far more enduring than confrontation, far more complete than any moment of vindication could ever be. I stood on the balcony one last time, letting the silence, the night, and the evidence of my triumph settle over me. The world had celebrated me, recognized me, and validated my existence in a way they could never have imagined. And they, the architects of my exclusion, the instigators of my humiliation, the authors of my pain, finally understood the depth of their miscalculation. Too late, they realized that the quiet, overlooked, underestimated girl had become unstoppable. I smiled faintly, coldly, completely. Revenge was not fire, revenge was ice. Revenge was patience, observation, intelligence, and execution. And now they knew. I was seen, I was celebrated, I was powerful. They were left with only realization, silence, and the bitter taste of their own misjudgment. And in that moment, the quiet satisfaction of absolute victory settled over me, unshakable, undeniable, complete. After the celebration, as the city lights glimmered beneath me, I realized that revenge is not a single moment, it is a journey, a transformation, a long, quiet accumulation of power that eventually overwhelms the arrogance that once sought to control you. Every insult, every slight, every moment of being overlooked had been a teacher, a guide, a stepping stone. I had taken their cruelty and turned it into strategy, their neglect and isolation into preparation, their arrogance into my roadmap. I thought about my sister, the one whose wedding had once made me feel invisible, whose family had prioritized appearances over love, over inclusion, over fairness. I remembered standing outside, watching the celebration I was denied, feeling the sharp edge of betrayal. But now, she was irrelevant. My triumph did not need to be acknowledged by her. My power did not need her validation. The world had seen me. The world had celebrated me, and that was more than enough. I reflected on every moment of the past months, the planning, the calculations, the patience. I had studied human behavior, observed patterns, anticipated reactions. Every move of my family had been analyzed, every flaw cataloged, every assumption dissected. I had learned that true revenge is not about chaos or confrontation. It is about control, precision, and timing. It is about knowing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. It is about making the world itself witness your rise while those who sought to diminish you are left powerless. The guests continued to celebrate, unaware of the depth of strategy behind the event, but I did. Every smile they shared, every toast they made, every moment of admiration was a validation of the quiet, relentless work I had invested. I moved through the crowd with grace, exchanging words and nods, acknowledging the people who had become part of my network, my support, my witness to the triumph that had once been unimaginable. And I observed my family. The shock on their faces had not faded, it had deepened. They whispered among themselves, attempting to regain control, attempting to understand, attempting to diminish the reality of my success. But it was impossible. Every attempt they made only reinforced the power I had accumulated, the influence I had gathered, the undeniable truth that I was no longer invisible. They had created the conditions for my growth through their arrogance and exclusion, and I had seized the opportunity flawlessly. The night became a canvas on which I painted the culmination of years of silent strategy. I realized that revenge is not merely about hurting others. It is about transforming your pain into influence, your exclusion into recognition, your suffering into empowerment. The quiet, underestimated girl had become a force that could not be ignored, a presence that could not be denied, a power that could not be challenged. I walked to the balcony again, alone. Letting the cool night air wash over me, I thought about patience, how crucial it had been, how transformative it had been. While others celebrated superficial victories, I had been cultivating real, sustainable influence. I had been building a network of admiration, respect, and recognition. Every slight, every moment of neglect, every whisper had contributed to the perfect orchestration of this moment. I reflected on the psychological nature of my triumph. True revenge is not driven by anger but by understanding. It is the ability to anticipate human behavior, to calculate reactions, to act decisively when the moment is inevitable. The world had witnessed my rise not through confrontation but through subtle, undeniable influence. And that influence was permanent. It would not fade with time or memory. It would remain as a testament to the patience, intelligence, and resilience of someone who had been underestimated. Even my closest family members were forced to acknowledge it, in silence if not in words. They had attempted to control me, to erase me, to determine my worth, and they had failed spectacularly. Their arrogance had blinded them to the quiet, relentless growth that had been taking place beneath their notice. And now the consequences of that misjudgment were undeniable. I had claimed my space, my recognition, my triumph, and the world had validated it. I realized that exclusion, humiliation, and betrayal can be transformed into powerful catalysts if approached with strategy and patience. They had thought they could erase me, but in doing so, they had set the stage for a rise that was inevitable, unstoppable, and absolute. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every act of neglect had been meticulously recorded in my mind, analyzed, and converted into fuel for my strategy. The celebration continued around me, but I remained focused, calm, composed. I had no need to confront, no need to argue, no need to explain. The scale of recognition, the magnitude of admiration, the breadth of influence was self-evident. My family had been powerless to stop it, powerless to understand it, powerless to reclaim any control over the narrative they had tried to dominate. And I thought about silence, the silence that had once been imposed upon me, the silence I had endured, the silence I had mastered. My rage had been silent. The transformation from overlooked girl to celebrated, influential, unstoppable woman had been quiet, calculated, inevitable. And when the moment arrived, the silence became a statement more powerful than words, more permanent than anger, more satisfying than confrontation. I allowed myself a rare smile, not of joy, not of celebration, but of quiet satisfaction. Knowing that the world had acknowledged my worth, celebrated my presence, and validated the years of endurance, observation, and intelligence that had led to this point. They had attempted to control me, to diminish me, to exclude me. They had failed. And now they understood too late that the quiet, underestimated girl had emerged stronger, smarter, and completely unstoppable. Revenge had not been about confrontation nor about spectacle. It had been about strategy, patience, observation, and execution. Every insult had been fuel, every exclusion a blueprint, every humiliation a stepping stone. And now the ultimate victory had been achieved. I had turned pain into power, exclusion into celebration, and invisibility into influence. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath me as I reflected on the journey. I had endured, I had waited, I had planned, and I had executed. The quiet girl had become unstoppable, and the consequences of underestimating her were permanent, undeniable, and irreversible. The night air was cool, but inside, I felt the warmth of triumph, the quiet, calculated, psychological, an absolute triumph that comes from turning every injustice into opportunity, every slight into strategy, and every humiliation into validation. And they, the ones who had caused me to feel small, had no power to undo it. They could only witness, helplessly, as the world celebrated me, recognized me, and validated my worth in ways they could not comprehend, influence, or control. The quiet revenge I had crafted was complete. The narrative had been reclaimed. The triumph was absolute. I had been invisible, erased, dismissed, and humiliated. And now I was seen, celebrated, respected, and remembered. I had transformed every act of cruelty, every moment of neglect, every whisper of dismissal into a legacy of patience, intelligence, and unstoppable power. And in that realization I understood that true revenge is eternal. It does not fade, it does not diminish, and it does not require acknowledgement from those who caused the pain. It simply exists, undeniable and absolute. And as I stood alone overlooking the city, I smiled faintly, coldly, completely. Revenge was not fire, revenge was ice. Revenge was patience, strategy, intelligence, and perfect execution. And now they knew. I was unstoppable, I was celebrated, I was powerful, and they were left to reckon with the consequences of their own arrogance, the weight of their own misjudgment, and the inevitability of a truth they had never anticipated. Night had settled, and with it, the weight of every insult, every slight, every humiliation I had endured came to its final resolution. They had tried to erase me from their lives, to diminish me, to make me invisible, but now the world itself had witnessed my rise. Every whispered joke, every casual dismissal, every moment of exclusion had led to this moment, the culmination of years of patience, strategy, and endurance. The city below sparkled like a reflection of the life I had built from the shadows of neglect, a life my family could never take from me. I walked among the guests, my movements deliberate, my gaze steady, my expression calm. Each smile I returned, each nod I gave, was a quiet assertion of my victory. The people around me celebrated not just my union, but my transformation, my strength, my presence. They did not know the depth of my planning, the meticulous observation, the silent calculation that had turned me from the overlook, invisible girl into the center of admiration and influence. Yet they felt it, even if only subconsciously. They were witnesses to something they could not fully understand, a triumph that had been meticulously orchestrated and flawlessly executed. My family watched, their faces betraying disbelief, frustration, confusion, and slowly the bitter taste of realization. They had attempted to dictate my worth, to control the narrative of my life, to decide who mattered and who did not. And yet here they were, powerless, unable to reverse the course of what had been set into motion. The quiet, underestimated girl they thought they could diminish had risen above their cruelty, had turned their negligence into a foundation for something greater, something undeniable. I stood still for a moment, letting the magnitude of the night sink in. I realized that revenge is not loud, it is not explosive, it is not immediate. True revenge is subtle, patient, and strategic. It is the accumulation of intelligence and endurance, the transformation of pain into influence, the conversion of humiliation into power. And it is revealed at the precise moment when those who wronged you can no longer do anything to undo it. Every laugh around me, every toast raised in my honor, every word of admiration spoken by those who had once been strangers or distant acquaintances reinforced the perfection of my plan. It was as though the world itself had conspired to validate my existence, to recognize my worth, and to celebrate the culmination of years of meticulous patience. I did not need to confront my family. I did not need to explain. I did not need to justify myself. The evidence was undeniable. My presence, my influence, my recognition, it spoke louder than words ever could. And as I looked at their faces, I could see it, the understanding slowly dawning that they had misjudged me. Every smile that once concealed mockery, every gesture of condescension, every assumption of my weakness had been catalogued and used against them, not with malice, but with calculated precision. Their power over me had been an illusion, and the moment of their realization was as sweet as it was inevitable. They had sown the seeds of my transformation, unaware that every slight was a stepping stone toward the ultimate assertion of my strength. The guests continued to celebrate, but I was already thinking beyond the night. Revenge is not only about a single victory, but about ensuring that the lessons of the past resonate indefinitely. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life, redefined my presence in the world, and transformed humiliation into empowerment. The memory of exclusion had become a symbol of patience. The memory of being dismissed had become a lesson in observation. The memory of being ignored had become the blueprint for influence. Every moment of suffering had been transformed into a foundation for lasting triumph. I walked to the balcony, overlooking the lights of the city that stretched endlessly beneath me. It was a silent acknowledgement of the journey I had endured, the patience, the calculation, the intelligence, the strategy that had brought me to this point. I understood now that the quiet, underestimated girl had become an unstoppable force. I had mastered silence, observation, and planning, and the culmination of these skills had manifested in a victory that was undeniable and permanent. Even as the night drew on and guests began to leave, the echoes of my triumph remained. The world had celebrated me, recognized my worth, and validated my existence in a way my family could never challenge. Their attempts to erase me, to diminish me, to dictate my life had not only failed, but had inadvertently contributed to the perfection of my plan. Every slight, every humiliation, every act of exclusion had been transformed into a tool for empowerment. I reflected on the psychological depth of revenge. It is not about fury, not about confrontation, not about anger. It is about understanding patience, intelligence, and timing. It is about transforming weakness into strength, invisibility into presence, neglect into influence. And when the moment is right, when the consequences are unavoidable, it is revealed in a way so complete, so undeniable, that those who wronged you are left powerless to challenge it. I allowed myself a quiet smile, knowing that my journey had reached its perfect conclusion. The quiet satisfaction of absolute strategic and patient revenge washed over me. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, ignored me, and now they were powerless to undo the reality I had created. They had attempted to control my life, but in doing so, they had inadvertently laid the groundwork for my ultimate triumph. As the city slept beneath the night sky, I understood the true nature of victory. It is not only about being seen, celebrated, or acknowledged. It is about the quiet transformation that occurs when patience, strategy, and intelligence turn suffering into power. It is about reclaiming the narrative, asserting influence, and demonstrating that those who attempted to diminish you were mistaken, and they had no choice but to witness it. I stood alone, feeling the weight of every insult, every slight, every moment of exclusion dissolve into the cold satisfaction of ultimate revenge. I was no longer invisible, I was no longer dismissed, I was no longer powerless. I had transformed every act of cruelty into evidence of my patience, intelligence, and relentless determination. The quiet, underestimated girl had become unstoppable, and nothing could reverse it. Revenge was complete. Not in anger, not in spectacle, but in the precise, deliberate, and inevitable assertion of power. They had been forced to witness the results of their own arrogance and cruelty, and the realization was inescapable. The world had celebrated me. The world had recognized me, and they had been powerless to stop it. I allowed myself a final smile, cold, faint, absolute. Revenge was not fire, it was ice. It was patient, deliberate, strategic, and inevitable, and in that truth, I found a satisfaction deeper than any anger, more enduring than any confrontation, and more complete than any vindication. I had been invisible, erased, dismissed, humiliated, and now I was seen, celebrated, respected, and remembered. They who had sought to control me had been forced to witness my triumph without the ability to interfere. They had underestimated me, misjudged me, and now they understood too late. The night ended, but the impact was eternal. My victory, crafted with patience, observation, and intelligence, was complete. The quiet, underestimated girl had transformed into a force that could not be ignored, diminished, or erased. And as the city slept, I stood victorious, calm, unstoppable, and completely satisfied. Revenge was mine, absolute, inevitable, and permanent. The end.